Somewhere right now, a notification is lighting up a phone. Someone said something online, someone else responded, a third person screenshotted it, a fourth person shared the screenshot with commentary. By morning, 50 people who have never met will have strong opinions about something that started as a misread tone in a group chat. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, probably watching it from a slight distance, probably with a drink in hand and an expression that lands somewhere between tired and unsurprised, is a person who has already quietly decided they want no part of it. They saw the thread, they read every word, they formed a clear opinion about exactly who was right and who was wrong and why, and then they put the phone face down on the counter and went to make dinner. Not because they don't care, not because they are above it, not because they have achieved some enlightened state of digital detachment that the rest of us should aspire to, but because they have seen this before in a different format, on a different platform, in a different decade, and they know, with the deep bone level knowing of people who have watched enough cycles complete themselves, exactly how it ends. This is a video about a generation that grew up before the performance of opinion became the primary currency of public life. A generation that learned, in ways that had nothing to do with social media, that most noise does not become signal, that most fires burn themselves out faster if you don't feed them. That the loudest voice in the room is very rarely the most accurate one. Today, we are going to look honestly at the psychology behind this pattern, not as a virtue, not as a flaw, but as something that was built carefully, quietly over decades out of a very specific set of experiences. And some of what we find may surprise you, including, perhaps, what it reveals about yourself. To understand why this generation moves the way it does through digital conflict, you have to go back to the world that made them, not to the internet, back further. Back to the 1970s and early 1980s, when the children who would become Gen X were very small, and the world around them was conducting a series of large, loud, very public experiments in how much chaos a society could absorb before something broke. They watched Watergate on television, or heard it discussed in lowered voices by adults who no longer seemed certain about anything. They watched institutions that had been treated as permanent reveal themselves as provisional. The church, the government, the corporation that had employed a parent for 20 years and then, one Tuesday, didn't anymore. The cultural air of their childhood was saturated with a particular flavour of disillusionment, not the dramatic disillusionment of protest and revolution, which had belonged to the generation just ahead of them, but something quieter and more corrosive, the disillusionment of aftermath, of the morning after the argument, when everyone is tired and nothing has been resolved and the dishes still need to be done. And then there were the homes themselves. Many of these children came home to houses where the adults were either absent, working, divorcing, renegotiating their own lives in ways that left little bandwidth for supervision or present, but emotionally unavailable in the specific way that people are unavailable when they are managing their own unprocessed difficulty. What this produced, in many cases, was a very particular kind of child, one who learned to read rooms before they learned to read books, who understood, without being told, when to make themselves small and when the adults had enough going on without adding your particular problem to the pile, who developed, as a survival skill, the ability to assess a situation quickly, decide whether their involvement was likely to help or hurt, and act accordingly. This is not a sad story, necessarily. Children are adaptive. They take the conditions they are given and they build something functional from them. But it is worth naming what was being built, because those skills, practiced 10,000 times across a childhood, don't simply stay in childhood. By the time this generation arrived at adolescence, they had developed what we might call an emotional economy, a set of unspoken rules about when feelings were worth expressing and when they were better managed internally, what was worth fighting for and what was better released, where to invest attention and where attention was simply being wasted. These rules were not written down, they were not taught in any classroom, they were absorbed the way children absorb everything important through the accumulated experience of watching what happened when people engaged with certain kinds of conflict and what happened when they didn't. What they mostly saw was this: public conflict was expensive. It cost energy, relationships, credibility, and time. It rarely produced the resolution it promised. The people who threw themselves into every argument, who performed their outrage loudly and consistently, often ended up exhausted and no closer to anything they actually wanted. And the people who chose their battles carefully, who let most things go and only dug in on the ones that genuinely mattered, seemed to navigate their lives with something that looked, from the outside, like dignity. This is where the psychology begins, not with indifference, with calibration. There is a concept in behavioral psychology sometimes called response threshold, the level of stimulus required before a person is moved to act. Different people have different thresholds for different things, shaped by their history and what that history taught them about the cost-benefit analysis of engagement. For this generation, the threshold for public conflict was set during childhood and adolescence at a level that most of the cultures around them, particularly the digital cultures that would arrive later, would find frustratingly high. They don't react to everything. Not because nothing moves them, but because they learned in a very embodied way that reacting to everything is a form of exhaustion that eventually costs you the ability to react to the things that actually matter. And then came the internet. Specifically, then came the version of the internet that rewarded reaction. That built entire systems of engagement, attention, and social currency around the speed and intensity of public response. That made the performance of opinion not just possible, but incentivized, where the more you expressed, the more you were seen, and the more you were seen, the more you apparently mattered. For a generation that had spent 30 years developing a finely calibrated instinct for when engagement was worth the cost, this felt, and the word that comes up again and again when people from this generation describe early social media, it felt exhausting, not immoral, not wrong, just deeply fundamentally exhausting in a way that was hard to explain to people who seemed to find it energizing. Because here is the thing that is easy to miss about this generation's relationship to social media drama. The thing that gets flattened when people describe it as mere cynicism or disengagement or being out of touch with how communication works. Now, it is not that they don't understand the dynamics. Most of them understand the dynamics extremely well. They can see the loop. They can identify exactly where the escalation began, exactly who benefited from each turn of the screw, exactly what everyone's actual need underneath the performance of outrage actually is. They have, in many cases, a clearer map of the territory than the people currently standing in the middle of it. What they are choosing, deliberately, consciously, often with considerable effort, is not to walk into it. The defining psychological traits of this group are worth examining carefully because they are more complex than they appear from the outside. The first is what we might call selective investment, the capacity developed through decades of practice to distinguish between what is genuinely important and what is important seeming. Between a conflict that has real stakes and a conflict that is performing the appearance of real stakes. This is not the same as not caring. It is in fact a form of caring more carefully, protecting attention and emotional resources the way someone who has lived through scarcity protects anything that can run out. The second is what we might call institutional skepticism. Not nihilism, not the belief that nothing matters, but a deeply ingrained reluctance to trust any system, platform, or institution at face value. A generation that watched the evening news stop being neutral, that watched corporations betray the communities they had promised to sustain, that watched political figures reveal themselves as ordinary and fallible in very public ways. This generation does not assume that the place where the argument is happening is a fair arena. They have seen enough rigged games to know when they are standing in front of one. The third trait, and perhaps the most important, is something that takes a little longer to name. Call it the long view. The capacity, earned through having lived enough cycles, to see the present moment in context. To remember that the argument that currently feels like the most urgent thing on the internet felt exactly that urgent 3 months ago, and the one 3 months before that, and the one before that. To have watched enough cycles of collective outrage rise, peak, consume enormous amounts of human energy, and then dissipate, leaving almost nothing changed except the people who gave themselves over to it, who are measurably more depleted than they were before. This is not wisdom necessarily, it is pattern recognition, but at a certain point, pattern recognition and wisdom are very difficult to tell apart. The armor this generation built is worth examining, because it is easy to mistake for something colder than it is. The detachment, the irony, the dry, sidelong humor that can make it hard to know, in any given moment, whether they are taking something seriously or not. The apparent ease with which they disengage from conversations that have become circular. The slight, almost imperceptible withdrawal that happens when a room or a thread or a relationship tips from genuine exchange into performance. This armor was built for specific reasons. It was built by children who learned that the most reliable protection from the chaos of other people's unresolved emotional business was a certain strategic distance. Not coldness distance, the ability to observe without being absorbed, to stay in proximity to difficulty without being reorganized by it. And this armor works. It genuinely works. It protects something real. But it comes with a cost that this generation is, in midlife, increasingly aware of the cost of sometimes being unable to take the armor off even when they want to, of being so practiced at observation that full participation can feel at times like a skill they are slightly out of practice with, of being so good at seeing the performance in other people's reactions that they occasionally lose access to their own. What is genuinely remarkable about this generation, what gets underestimated consistently by the cultures around them, is what that particular formation produced in terms of cognitive capacity, the ability to hold complexity without needing to resolve it, to sit with ambiguity, to resist the pull of simple narratives that explain everything neatly and satisfyingly but leave out anything that doesn't fit, to read between the lines of what people say publicly and understand what is actually being communicated, to assess a situation without immediately needing to declare a position on it. These are not small things. In a cultural moment that rewards certainty, speed, and volume, that treats the immediate declaration of position as a sign of moral seriousness, the capacity to wait, to observe, to update your understanding before committing to a response is genuinely rare and genuinely valuable. Even when it looks from the outside like not caring, in professional environments, this psychology expresses itself in ways that can be both extraordinary and occasionally maddening, depending on where you're standing. They are, as a rule, excellent at crisis. When something genuinely goes wrong, not performatively wrong, not internet wrong, but actually wrong, with real consequences, they are often the calmest people in the room. Not because they are unaffected, but because their nervous system has been calibrated through long practice to distinguish between the level of response a situation actually requires and the level of response the social pressure of the moment is demanding. They do not match the room's anxiety. They assess it, and then they do the next necessary thing. They are also, as managers and colleagues, deeply pragmatic about conflict. They will not avoid a necessary conversation. In fact, many of them have a low tolerance for the passive-aggressive non-communication that grows up around avoided conversations. But they bring to difficult conversations the same long-view sensibility they bring to everything. What outcome are we actually trying to reach here? What is the most direct path to that outcome? And how do we get there without making the situation worse than it needs to be? What they often struggle with professionally is the performance layer, the requirement in many organizational cultures to visibly perform engagement and enthusiasm and investment, to demonstrate in public and observable ways that you are committed and passionate and aligned with the vision. For a generation that learned to keep its interior life interior, that learned that visible emotion was at best inconvenient and at worst a liability, this kind of demanded performance can feel not just uncomfortable, faintly dishonest, like being asked to put on a show for an audience that should be able to see the work itself. In midlife, this generation carries a particular set of pressures that intersect in complicated ways with their psychology. There are the external pressures, the sandwich generation reality of aging parents and children who are not yet fully launched in a financial landscape that looks nothing like what any reasonable planning would have predicted. The career disruptions, the health shifts, the quiet renegotiation of what is still possible and what needs to be released. But there is also an internal pressure that is harder to name. The accumulated cost of decades of strategic non-engagement, the growing awareness that the distance that protected them has also, in some ways, kept them from things they wanted. The recognition that the irony, while genuinely useful, has sometimes functioned as a reason not to be vulnerable in moments when vulnerability might have been the better choice. Many people in this generation are arriving somewhere in their 40s and 50s at a question they have been circling for a long time. Not whether to engage with the world, they engage with the world constantly in quiet, practical, effective ways, but whether to let the world in, whether to allow more of what moves them to be visible, whether the armor, which was so necessary for so long, is still serving them in the ways it once did. In their closest relationships, this psychology shows up with a particular kind of complexity. They are the good ones, and most of them are trying to be the good ones, deeply loyal. Once you have earned their trust, which takes time and which requires that you demonstrate over a sustained period that you are what you appear to be, they are in. Completely, the kind of in that means showing up at 3 a.m. without being asked and not mentioning it afterward. But the process of earning that trust can be opaque to people who haven't encountered it before. The careful observation that precedes commitment, the slow reveal of their own interior, the way they test not by asking questions, but by watching what you do when you don't know you're being watched. The occasional bluntness that arrives after a long period of apparent ease when they finally decide you can handle an honest thing. With their children, many of them have done something deliberate and worth acknowledging. They have in large numbers made a conscious choice to create more emotional space than they were given. To name feelings explicitly, to invite conversation about the difficult things rather than hoping the difficult things resolve themselves in silence. To say out loud things that the adults in their own childhoods would have found impossibly exposing. This is not accidental. It is the result of people who spent significant time understanding their own formation and deciding, with some effort, to do it differently. Not perfectly, but differently. The turning inward that happens for this generation in midlife is worth paying attention to because it takes a form that is easy to miss. It does not, usually, look like a dramatic exit from public life. It does not announce itself. What it looks like from the outside is a slight but consistent reorientation of attention away from things that were once important seeming and toward things that are quietly, stubbornly sustaining. Deeper friendships, work that connects to something that matters, physical presence in actual places, the cultivation of interior richness, books, music, conversation, the kind of engagement with ideas that happens slowly and doesn't require an audience, and a very deliberate narrowing of what gets their energy, not because they have given up on the world, they haven't, but because they have done the math over and over and arrived at the same conclusion every time. The math says you have a finite amount of attention. The question is not whether to spend it. The question is what you are buying with it. For a generation that watched platform after platform monetize the performance of conflict, the answer arrived at not through philosophy, but through the accumulated experience of watching what the performance costs is increasingly not this. There is something this generation carries that doesn't get named often enough. Something that sits underneath the detachment and the irony and the carefully calibrated distance from other people's noise. A genuine, deeply held belief that most people, most of the time, are doing the best they can with what they were given. That the person performing outrage online is probably in some kind of pain that has nothing to do with the thing they appear to be angry about. That the argument is almost never about what the argument is about. That underneath the volume and the escalation and the certainty, most people are trying to be seen and understood and taken seriously, and that the platform is just where they learn to do that. This generation sees this not because they are superior, but because they spent a childhood learning to read beneath the surface of what people present, to understand what the performance means rather than only what it says. They may not be the loudest presence in any digital room. They may not be the ones setting the terms of the conversation or driving the cycles of collective reaction that define so much of how we talk to each other now. But find the person who, in the middle of the noise, is still thinking clearly, who is asking the questions that don't have easy answers, who is holding space for the complexity that the platform wants to flatten, who is choosing deliberately and with full awareness of what they are choosing to protect their attention for the things that matter, and you will almost always find them there. Quietly, without announcement, the way they learned to do everything. If any of this landed somewhere real for you, if some part of this named something you have been doing for years without quite having the language for it, I would genuinely like to know this. What is the one moment you realized that stepping back from a conflict rather than stepping into it was actually the more honest choice? Not the more comfortable one, the more honest one. That distinction matters, and I think the answers will be worth reading. If this kind of examination psychology understood through lived experience, not through clinical categories, is something you want more of, then stay close to this channel. What we are building here is not a library of content. It is a practice of looking at yourself and the people around you with more precision and more compassion than most of us were ever taught was possible. That kind of seeing changes things quietly, the way the best things always do.